Good afternoon, and welcome to Pittsburgh City Council's post-agenda meeting for today, June 23rd, 2021. Today's post-agenda meeting is on legislation that was introduced by Councilman Lavelle and I, calling an educational emergency in the city of Pittsburgh. And so I want to welcome you, all of you, for coming. We are joined by Councilwoman Gross, Councilman Lavelle, Councilwoman Strasburger, and Council President Smith. Before COVID, there was already an existing racial achievement gap in the Pittsburgh public schools and really Black kids all throughout the city. As you know, a few months ago, we introduced legislation because we believe that the achievement gap has reached emergency, urgent levels. The achievement gap for African American students in Pittsburgh, but specifically in the public schools, are significant and almost devastating to these kids. COVID, we know, has exacerbated those existing problems. Many of these kids were a few grade levels behind. Now, after COVID, they may be as upwards to 4 to 5 grade levels behind proficiently. We know that Black students have had essential worker parents and may have been unable, those parents have been unable to provide educational support at home. We know that Black people have disproportionately affected by the pandemic health-wise, and Black students particularly have had a difficult time adjusting to online learning. We also know the number of students that just didn't log in. And so we want to talk today about what the achievement gap is and how we think the current state is of educational achievement for Black kids in the public schools. We are excited to be joined by this all-star panel today. We have former Councilman Salah Houdin, who is the school board director and who has been involved in this issue for a number of years. We have James Fogarty, from the head of A+ Schools. We have Jean Walker for Black Women for Better Education, Tracy Reed, Black Women for Better Education, and Walter Lewis, Executive Director of the Homewood Children's Village, that does a lot of work in the schools and a lot of work and after school and both in school and after school work specifically for children. Welcome all to today's post-agenda meeting. We're going to ask that James Fogarty would start off and give us a sort of overview of the lay of the land.
Thank you, Councilman Burgess, and thank you to the rest of the council for having us today. Give me 1 second as I go to share my screen. Today's topic, really focusing on gaps in educational opportunities and outcomes. Want to just give you a quick overview of who we are at A+ Schools so folks know. Our mission is really to make sure every child in Pittsburgh, especially Black and brown children, gets the high quality education they deserve. Really what we're looking for is a Pittsburgh where every child succeeds. We've been around since 2004 and in different iterations, but what we're currently really working on is trying to engage community, schools, educators, students, teachers, parents, in this project of identifying problems and solving them so that we can remove barriers to learning in our communities. I wanted to start with a comparable set of cities and just sort of their overall achievement to give you a sense of where Pittsburgh lays in compared to cities with similar demographics in their school system. Some are larger, some are much smaller, but they're similar in the sense that they have high rates of students in poverty, high numbers of African American students in the public schools. And what you see is Pittsburgh laying sort of kind of above the average of the group of cities here, though below Cincinnati. And Cincinnati becomes a talking point for me as we go forward, because I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that they're doing as we think about how a city and school collaborative might be able to support your work. But what you see is about half of our students at 3rd grade are reading proficiently at grade level. Only about 20% are doing math at grade level. But you look at sort of across the board in cities from Philadelphia to Baltimore, you see a similar or lower range there. So, just wanting to put us in that kind of large city context. The other set of data that I wanted to put us into context of is looking at the achievement gaps across the NAEP, which is the National Assessment for Educational Progress. It's what's also known as the nation's report card. This happens every year. data is collected from samples across the country, and then we look at that data to understand how our students are progressing over time. And what we see is gaps of kind of consistent gaps, even though achievement is rising slightly in reading and slightly in math. You see kind of consistent gaps over the last 16 years or 18 years, right? And so for us, what we wanted to do is like, let's contextualize Pittsburgh to understand that this emergency is not just a Pittsburgh emergency, it's a national one. And it's one that's been going on for far too long and is related to systemic racism, both within our city, but also in the national milieu. But we can look more deeply at Pittsburgh to understand what's happening, right? In Pittsburgh, and this data comes from the state's ESSA dashboard for 2020, per pupil spending is more equal than equitable. So what you see, these dots represent Pittsburgh public schools, both district and charter schools. And what you see is a different even though as you look at the rates of poverty, which are on the y-axis, you see a range of about between $20,000 and $22,000 that's being spent at schools, regardless of the need of the students in the school, right? That's driven in a lot of ways by the programming that's offered at the school and the educational delivery model. So it's about staffing rather than need. And so really thinking through, how do those fixed costs translate into spending at schools, and how do we think about how we can encourage or support the district to spend more money, or bring outside resources like what the Home and Children's Village is doing and what city parks might be doing or other organizations might do to help support some of these differences and meet the needs in those schools. The second input, right? Like I'm thinking, I'm going to start you with inputs to help you understand why the gaps in achievement are what they are, is attendance, right? If you look at the difference in kindergarten attendance between Black and white students, you see Black students are 3 times more likely to be chronically absent, which means they miss 10% or more of the days, almost a full month of school per year, than white students in kindergarten, and about twice as likely to be chronically absent in 9th grade. Both of those are critical years, right? We know from research out of Chicago that a student who is not chronically absent and getting a B or better grade point average is much more likely to graduate from high school and go on to college than someone who is, right? And so that level of data that we look at, we want to make sure school by school that we're reducing chronic absence for all students, but especially for Black and brown students who seem to be experiencing it at much higher rates. And you can see sort of the overall picture of chronic absence to the right on the slide here. So looking at research from the American Institutes for Research and Attendance Works, what we see is, what gets kids to school, right? And really at the core of this is our relationships. And when I was looking at this data, I wanted to look at, okay, what are some other ways in which there are things that are in the city that might be impacting getting kids to school? The American Institutes for Research suggests this method that's in figure 3 in the top right corner of the slide to talk about how you can look at chronic absence and maybe make a change, right? And one of the things I was looking at, if you look at the bottom right, you'll see a map that was created by the Create Lab at CMU that put together the data around chronic absence. And these are our these are our K to 8 schools. And what you see is the red dots are where chronic absence is 65% or higher. Orange is more in the 50% range. And to the left, you'll see the county's elevated blood lead level map. And what I noticed, and again, this is correlation causation, no, but could the impact of lead on cognitive and behavioral issues within children be causing and driving some of the chronic absence that we're seeing in our schools in both the north side and west? I think it's worth exploring, and it's also something that council has power to change, right? Whether through the occupancy permit process or otherwise, to try and reduce the lead levels that children are experiencing, which we know has an impact on their learning. Another input is who teaches, right? And so what we see is a district where the demographics of the teaching force do not align with the student diversity. Now, I will say, to Pittsburgh's credit, we have about twice as many students of teachers, almost 3 times as many teachers of color as the state average. State average for teachers of color is about 6%, right? And so we see more teachers of color here and more Black teachers in the city of Pittsburgh than you would in outlying suburban areas. That being said, the mismatch, the cultural mismatch, we know matters, right? If you look at some research that was done out of the National Bureau of Economic Research, Black teachers matter, right? A Black student with at least one Black teacher in grades K to 3 was 13% more likely to graduate from high school and 19% more likely to enroll in college than their same school, same race peers that did not have a Black teacher, right? And this was a study done out of North Carolina. Critical here is just the importance of having that cultural mismatch, that cultural match and cultural affinity. We're not saying that it's the only thing. Certainly Black and white teachers can be great, and certainly Black and white teachers can be bad for kids, right? We know that, but our hope is to really think about how we might diversify the teacher pipeline. Why? Because we know from research as well that Black students, younger Black students, are seen as older, perceived as older, and therefore more deserving of punishment by white teachers. And so what we see playing out is a huge disparity in the suspension rates among Black and white students. We also see, because we know that gifted education is recommended, or testing is usually recommended by the teacher, we see a huge gap between who's identified as gifted in our district, right? With only 18% of Black students identified versus 66% of white students. And you can see where there's high concentrations of poverty in our schools, we have lower rates of identification of gifted. It's critical because those gifted identifications lead to AP course taking and other higher level courses, which prepare kids better for college. And so you take those inputs, right, of a mismatch of teacher and student demographics, sort of an equal, not equitable set of spending inputs, and chronic absence rates, which are both determined both at home and at school by the school cultures. And you see the outcomes, right? We have 43% of Black students over the years 2017 to 2019 reading at grade level by third grade. Why is third grade reading so important? We know it's tied to all kinds of attendant outcomes down the road. Kids learn to read up to third grade. They read to learn fourth grade on. And so if you're not reading at grade level by third grade, it becomes that more difficult to catch up, and you're much more likely to drop out than your peer who is reading at grade level. And we see right here in terms of a gap, we see a gap of 31 points, right? Not dissimilar from the gap we saw at the NAEP, right? Which I think was 32 between white and Black students, right? So we're trailing or tracking to what the national story is, but that national story isn't a good one for Black and brown children in our district. Algebra 1, we look at Algebra 1 proficiency because we know Bob Moses's algebra project and other research has shown if a student can take and pass algebra in 8th grade, they're much more likely to do higher level math, which opens the door to college and college success, especially engineering programs and other STEM and STEAM related fields. And what we see for our Black and brown students is much lower levels of passage of the Algebra 1 keystone than for white students, right? White students are 4 times more likely than Black students to pass the keystone, and over 2 times more likely than Hispanic students to pass the Algebra 1 keystone. And I use this quote because Dr. Hamill will use it with you, I'm sure. It's a quote that is attributed to Edwards Deming, who's a quality improvement guru. But every system is perfectly designed for the results it gets. So is it any wonder then, so if you see the inputs and you see some of the achievement outputs, that we have these huge disparities in college readiness. What's here is SAT college readiness, the percent of students that meet that benchmark. So there's a score both for literature and for math. And what we see is over the last 3 years, about a little over half of our students were meeting the literature college readiness benchmark, and a little over a third were meeting it for math. But that there are huge disparities between Black and white, almost 44 point difference between Black and white in terms of readiness, and over 46 points difference between Black and white in math readiness. So significant gaps. And then the 2019 graduation rate, when we look at grad rates, again, a 10-point gap between Black and white graduating. Significantly, my worry around graduation rates is also around young Black men, where only 69% are graduating within 4 years, which just increases their likelihood of not being able to go on and complete a 2-year or 4-year degree or certification program or even workforce training program. All of this is to say is we know the problem. Our systems are designed to fail Black and brown children and families. And as an organization, I think for too long, we focused on what doesn't work. And that doesn't work, right? If we continue to put out graduates and only 30% of them are graduating from college or trade school in 6 years, that's over 1,500 students per year that are not graduating from college or trade school in 6 years. So how are they supposed to participate in the jobs of today that exist here in our community, right? Those STEAM jobs, those jobs in those, even in the trades, right? You still need at least a 2-year certification. And most of our students, 70% of them, are not completing that within 6 years. We got to work differently, right? Data alone isn't driving change, nor is massive investment. We've had massive investment in our schools over the last few years. Student teacher ratio of 11-to-1, per pupil spending of about $27,000, a median teacher salary over $90,000. So we're doing right by our teachers, and we're spending money on it. But unless we change things systemically and work together across these interrelated silos, we're worried that we're not going to get enough change. And the thing is, we know it works, right? When you look at the average data, it creates a really bad picture. But if you look at this specific instance, you can see places where success is happening. And where success is happening, they're centering students, they're putting data to work, and they're working collaboratively, both with each other as teachers and staff, but also with the community, families, and organizations. And we see that schools can get all students ready by graduation, close early literacy gaps, reduce suspensions without increasing disruption, create cultures where teachers thrive, create significant learning growth, and eliminate chronic absence. I'm going to go through this quickly because I've already exceeded my time, but just if you want to learn more, you can go to our report to the community at ourschoolspittsburgh.org and read up. But we want you to imagine a Pittsburgh where every student starts school ready to learn, reads at grade level, attends school every day where they're safe, known, and belong, participates in a high quality out of school time program, stable home, clean drinking water, and nutritious food to support learning. Every student has extra help that needs it, and graduates from high school ready for the college or career of their choice. I thank you for the time and the opportunity to present to you today. I know that was a quick pass through, but I want to give our other participants in the panel time to be able to tell you their stories as well.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to go to our invited guests kind of in the order in which I announced them. And next we have our former colleague and certainly now the godfather of Black politics in Pittsburgh, a current member of the Pittsburgh Public School Board, and that is Mr. Salahuddin.
Thank you, Dr. Burgess. I want to first decline the title of Godfather of Black Politics in Pittsburgh. It's enough for me to just try to be my godfather of my children who are really my godchildren. I want to just thank you for convening this conversation, Reverend Burgess, because it's a conversation that we have not spent enough time in this city having. For example, I hope at some point in this conversation, you and Councilman Lavelle and the other city council members will have an opportunity to expound upon the question, why should city council or the mayor be involved in a conversation about education? What business is it of yours? What is the relationship between public education and public service, the city of Pittsburgh? That's important for people to understand. Otherwise, people will think that council is stepping outside of its zone and interfering with the school board. And while we have that conversation, we will not be having the conversation that Mr. Fogarty just had about what's going on in the schools. So I thank you for convening this conversation. I support the notion that there is a crisis of education in Pittsburgh public schools. Some people will deny that there is a crisis. Others will be angry with you that you put it in words, that you said it, you said the quiet part out loud. And but I think if we share throughout the city the data that we just saw presented by Mr. Fogarty, and if we share the report of the Pittsburgh Human Relations Commission, all of the results of those sources are the same. They don't contradict each other. They all say there is an educational crisis in the city of Pittsburgh. Can Pittsburgh become a successful city if it has a failing school district? I don't think so. I think that if we have hopes and aspirations for Pittsburgh to excel as a city among other cities in the country, the degree to which we create a high-performing school district will be a part of that success story, or it'll be a part of that failure story. We can convert the current failing school system, at least failing certainly for Black children, we can reverse that. We can convert that into a successful, high thriving school district. It's not impossible. We know what we have to do. The question is, do we have the will to do it? And this is the first, I hope, of ongoing conversation between the city and the school district. I look forward to the incoming mayor to be committed to continuing this conversation, and look forward to hearing from my colleagues who are also on the line. And thank you again.
Thank you very much. That brings us to Gene Walker.
Mr. Chair, if I
yes.
might, I deeply apologize, but I just wanted to say that I care deeply about this issue. I also am double booked with a conference that was scheduled more than a year ago that is highly participatory and then I need to get back to. But please know, for the other speakers, I will be tuning into this conversation after the fact and watching it and continuing to take notes like I have been, and look forward to participating in the future hearings. And if I have any questions of any of the guest speakers, I certainly will follow up afterwards. So thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to further conversation.
Thank you very much, Councilwoman. That brings us to Gene Walker, Black Women for Better Education. Gene.
Burgess, and thank you all for putting this together. So I'm Gene Walker. I was one of the candidates endorsed by Black Women for Better Education, and I'm looking forward to being the school board representative for District 9 after the November election, and joining Sala and my friend Tracy in continuing this conversation going forward. Just quickly, I'm a product of the Pittsburgh Public Schools.
Gene, we're having some problem with your microphone. That you may want to not use. I don't know why, but you're coming across to us choppy. Are other people hearing him as choppy too?
Is that better?
No. You may want to use the computer. I'm not sure if you're using that remote piece or not. So whatever that you're doing, you may want to do the opposite. So if you're using a remote piece, you may not want to use it if you're.
Is that better? Is that better for you?
No, it's worse.
It's worse. Can you go to Tracy and then I'll try to fix my audio and come back?
That'd be great. All right, thank you. Tracy Reed, Black Women for Better Education. Tracy, if you do not mind, you could come and chat with us now.
Absolutely. I just trying to turn on my camera. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you and see
great.
you.
Great. Thanks. Well, thank you for being brave enough to have this conversation, and thank you for having me today. Black Women for a Better Education is a coalition of Black women who are moms, educators, taxpayers, who care deeply about the education of Black kids in the city. We are not a coalition that's just about what's wrong with Pittsburgh Public, but really we're looking to examine what is better practice for Black kids and for all kids in our region. So with regard to this particular topic, Pittsburgh has been in a state of emergency with respect to education for Black people for decades. It's not a new phenomenon. Black kids have trailed behind their white counterparts for some time now, and it's only been in recent years when standardized tests present the evidence about how poorly Black kids are faring, that it has become incredibly obvious to everyone that Black kids are not getting the same level of education that white kids are getting. And we should think about how this crisis manifests itself. Black Pittsburgh lags behind our counterparts. We lag behind our counterparts other parts of the country in terms of health and income, home ownership, all of the that are sort of markers of a great place to and the city is losing Black population. So this is not a criticism of Pittsburgh. I grew up in Pittsburgh. I'm a Pittsburgher at heart. But if we're to become a city where Black people really thrive, our schools have to improve, and they have to improve not only for the Black students who we wish to attract, but we have to do a good job by the kids who are in our schools now. I think lots of our conversation around what has to happen in our schools revolves around who we want to come into our schools. And we have to get laser focused on how to do a great job by the kids that we're serving now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. That takes us, let's see if we can get Jean. Jean, you think you're ready now?
So is this better? Same?
I think it sounds pretty much the same.
Oh man, I must be having some internet issues here.
Well, I think we'll hear most of you. So I don't want to.
Well, just briefly, I am a product of Pittsburgh Public Schools and the father of two Pittsburgh Public School graduates. And so when I joined up with Black Women for Better Education and the four others that ran for school board this year, I did so because of the experience that I had both as a student and a father in wanting best for all of our kids here in Pittsburgh, specifically the Black and brown kids. And so it starts for me with conversations like this, talking with the folks in our community and around our city who can work together to make sure that all of the interested parties are moving in the same direction to improve the quality of life and quality of education for our kids. And so this is an important step in that process. And one of the pieces of my platform that I ran on, which was making sure that the city and the school district began to have important dialogue because we are interconnected in our success and failure. And so I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. And thanks again for having me on today.
Okay, thank you very much. That takes us to Walter Lewis, Executive Director of the Homewood Children's Village and all-around nice guy.
Thank you, Reverend Burgess. Thank you all for having me today. And again, as the other folks have said, just for having this conversation. Again, I'm Walter Lewis, President, CEO of the Homewood Children's Village. And, really, with the Children's Village, we've been at this for a little over a decade now, focused primarily in the Homewood area. But, we serve kids who live and learn in Homewood, which means that, we work with young people in East Hills and Lincoln Leamington and Larimer, Wilkinsburg, and sometimes other parts of the city is, our community can be very transient. So we've got a lot of young people who now live in the Hill District and, now live in Penn Hills. And so, really just doing what we can to work alongside, our school district to improve the quality of education for our children. And we know that it takes a whole child approach. We think that, we can't look at education as only something that happens within classrooms. And I think one of the things that I think is really critical in this conversation, that if we didn't know it before, we should all be well aware now that the pandemic has kind of reminded us that, education really begins at home. Right? Parents are children's first teachers, and that's where education starts. It then goes into the school systems and it returns to the community. And so I think a big piece of what we have to bring back is the community's role in education. I think there's way too many parents, way too many community members who don't feel like they have a place within their child's education. And I think, Sala, to your point around even some people's perceptions of city council and other folks in the city, maybe not having a stake in education, I think that's not the right way to look at it. We care, all of us care about the kids in our city and that quality of education, and that matters regardless of whether you have a child, don't have a child, what age your child is. And so we need to figure out how we can get back to the community really having a much stronger stake within the education of the children. And I think a lot of what we do at the Children's Village is really trying to return to that, that approach. We believe in that notion that it takes a village. And so how do we activate all of the folks within the lives of young people to really improve the quality of education? So again, I'm excited about this conversation. James, I really appreciate, the data that you shared and some of the work that you guys do at A+ Schools, because it's really important to take a data-driven approach when we're looking at these issues. To Tracy's point, a lot of these issues have existed for quite some time, but when you're able to see the data in real time and look at what it means and what the implications are, you can begin to activate some solutions around that data and begin to, hold yourself accountable and others accountable for what we're doing in terms of making an impact. So again, excited to be here today for this conversation, and thankful to City Council, Reverend Burgess, Councilman Lavelle, and everyone else who put this together. So thank you guys.
Thank you very much. And so rather than to comment, I'm going to let members of council, I'm going to ask my co-convener, Councilman Lavelle, to kind of start us off, and then I'll ask for comments and conversation from members of council. Mr. Lavelle.
Thank you, Reverend Burgess. So a couple questions, and maybe even some context would may be helpful to this conversation, because Sala, you mentioned the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission and the report they did. And you and I were sort of having this conversation a year ago when I was expressing my concern of the state of affairs. And you asked me, had I read the report? And I told you I wasn't even aware of the report. And so I went and got it and read it, and then became even more concerned than I was previously. But that report, if my understanding is correct, came way of a lawsuit that was actually filed against the school district because of concern around the state of affairs and the education of Black children. So I was hoping you could just give us a little context to how the Pennsylvania Commission on Human Relations got involved, and which have now been involved, my understanding, for at least 10 years now, of which they were supposed to have done an initial report, monitored the school district, and then walked away. But at the end of each time, they said, well, this is still so bad, we have to stay involved. So could you give us a little context?
Yes, thank you. I think it's important to learn that Black parents in Pittsburgh have been fighting this fight for a very long time. And to my knowledge, in an organized way, they've been fighting it since 1968 when there was an organization formed called Blacks for Quality Education. And I think it was in 1992 that the group of parents filed a lawsuit against the school district to get them to acknowledge and change the fact that Black children were failing with a huge achievement gap between Black children and white children. And the courts ordered the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission to oversee the promises for making change that the school district had made. And unfortunately, in my judgment, the oversight by the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission has not been as strict as it needs to be in holding the school district accountable for the change that would improve the conditions of education for Black children in Pittsburgh. So for a long time, the Human Relations Commission would get the school district to agree to certain changes, and then they would come back in 5 years to see whether or not the changes were made. And because there are no consequences for the school district not making changes, every time they came back and did a 5-year report, there was no improvement to speak of. And this last report done by the Human Relations Commission was similar to previous reports. They would do an analysis of the reading and math capabilities up to 3rd grade, and beyond 3rd grade, they'd look at the Keystone results and then make a report to the district that Black children were still being failed by public education and it needs to change. And the school district would receive the report and say, okay, we're going to change, come back in 5 years and evaluate us again to see whether or not changes were made. Well, we are getting tired of that dance. And the commission report that was the last report that was done and submitted in October of last year, I think wasn't even a 5-year report, it was probably a 10-year report. And so the commission verified that there are still huge achievement gaps between Black students and white students and in Pittsburgh public schools. We know how to fix these gaps. And so now the question is, will we do what it is that must be done? And when we look at the decline in student enrollment and the decline in population, the city of Pittsburgh becomes aware that education, public education in Pittsburgh is an important ingredient in that design. And if they don't find a way to join in with the community to force the school district of Pittsburgh to make the changes that need to be made in order to create a high quality school system, then the population of the city will continue to decline. The enrollment in public schools will continue to decline. The increase in crime and violence will continue to increase, and we will have missed an important opportunity. So this is a really important conversation. And I want to hold up Brother Lewis from the Homewood Children's Village for just a moment, because they are very good at starting early involvement in education for children. They even have like a baby college where parents of babies can go to school about how to best educate their children. We've got to start very early in closing this achievement gap and getting our children ready for learning. That starts pre-kindergarten, preschool. We've got to start as early as we can. And I want to thank again, Brother Lewis, for giving us the model for early education and early engagement in Pittsburgh Public Schools. Thank you.
Thank you, Sala, and thank you for the context. In your remarks just now and in your prior remarks, you also spoke about why is sort of city council engaging in this conversation. The reality is, and you just outlined it, the two are tied together. The success of our school district is critical to the success of the city as a whole. And we must collectively figure out how to solve for this issue, because my personal belief is if it was strictly up to the school district to solve it, they would have been able to solve it. But they haven't. And so it's going to take a collective action, both from the city, and there's ways that we can support what is happening at the school district. And we should be supporting what is happening at the school district. And even Mr. Lewis said, you know, education doesn't just happen in the schools. It happens at homes. It happens with what's happening before you get to the schools. And Mr. Fogarty spoke about lead levels and things that we can be doing. So I have a sort of a two-part question, sort of, I guess, aimed at Mr. Fogarty and Mr. Lewis to begin, but anyone can feel free to chime in. One, at the end of your presentation, Mr. Fogarty, you mentioned that we do see successes. You highlighted some schools that are doing some good things. And you said that we do know we can close achievement gaps. I'm hoping you can give us some examples of, one, what can be done to address the achievement gap. I think what's also worth noting is that when you really look at the data, the average PPS student isn't doing that great. It's just that the average Black student is just doing so much worse that it just stands out. So I'd be interested to hear from you. What success models have you seen? You mentioned early in your remarks, I think it was Indianapolis, that may be doing some sort of unique and good things. So I'd be interested to hear about that. But in the second part to the question is, once we get through that, what do you believe we as a city can be doing to contribute to the academic success of our children?
Certainly, and thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, so when we look across cities, Cincinnati was the city I mentioned, though Indianapolis is doing some interesting things with the Mind Trust right now in terms of expanding and creating new schools. But in Cincinnati, what they've done is made a generational commitment to collective impact through the organization Strive Together. Strive Together is partnered with the Children's Hospital in Cincinnati. Cincinnati's Children's Hospital has made third grade reading one of its core mission strategic platforms because they know that so many health outcomes are tied to whether or not children are reading by third grade. And so they've taken this kind of continuous improvement approach and collective impact approach, something that Walter's been doing in Homewood for the last 10 years, right? Like they've been working on this approach and really incubating a lot of things. Now, you know, when I say that, it means both the city, the Children's Hospital, the funders, they've created community schools, right? It's really taking that holistic approach towards educating the child, and they have data behind it, right? Like they know with some degree of certainty what's working and what isn't school by school. And I mention that because when we look at schools like, and I'll mention Arsenal 6-8. Arsenal 6-8 is a school that serves a high number of refugee children, many English language learners. And each year they've been in the top 15% of academic growth in the state for the last 7 years. And one of the things that they have done not only have they been recognized as a community school, but prior to that recognition by the board, where they had programming in the school that would allow any child that went to Arsenal 6 to 8 to be able to stay there till 5:30 at the end of the day, right? So they'd be connected to a caring program after school, right? We know how critical out of school time programming can be to build those strong relationships, to create engagement, and to create another space where a child can learn, but in a different environment. The other thing that school does really, really well is they've made a commitment to grow academics for all children, right? So whereas some schools have the strategy of like, let's triage and take the kids that have the greatest needs and really figure out how we can grow them. What they said is, look, if we can do that with a smaller number of kids that are basic or below basic on our tests, why can't we do that for everyone? And so they just make it their mission to destroy, and these are the words of their principle, to just destroy the expectations that are put in those academic growth predictions that are put forth by the state every year. And so it's both kind of internally having a strong leader who really understands how to drive instruction, but also externally having good partners, not only with the community, but with also with the families, and using community intermediaries to support what they do. So I think like one of the things I would encourage council to do as you're thinking about this issue and thinking about how you might craft legislation is one, look to our neighbors just down the Ohio and Cincinnati and reach out, go visit, go see. The other thing is, and I'm happy to, and I'm sure others in this call would be, to take you on a tour of some of the high performing buildings in our city, right? And show you what they're doing. I know Dilworth is one that we've mentioned before. They do a ton around both culturally relevant pedagogy, but also just around like improving individual teacher practice through reflection. And Dr. Lamar has been a great leader at that school for many years in terms of making sure that all children learn at a high level there. So I'll leave it there. I think, there are lots in terms of like the teaching and learning practices and the environments in the school that are important. But when I come back to, if you take this collective impact approach, if you get everyone aligned around goals, and then if you start to just look at these are problems that are solvable and which ones should we solve first and prioritize with the community, co-creating, co-designing that, we'll get there, right? And I truly believe we have everything we need in the city. We're like 4th per capita in foundation funding. We have one of the highest funded, best funded urban school systems in the country at $27,000 per pupil. So I won't believe that this is impossible to fix. I actually think that this is fixable and fixable in a quick time span if we align our efforts together and know that that's not going to be easy work.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I absolutely agree with James. I think that strategy of collective impact is so critical and so crucial to the success of what we want to see for our children, because again, we're talking about something that impacts all of us in the city, whether again, we have children or not. And so really figuring out how we can get all of the different organizations, agencies, and entities to really work together. I agree with you, Councilman Lavelle, that you mentioned like the city has a role to play in supporting, schools and schooling. It doesn't necessarily mean you guys are going to all of a sudden become teachers, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you're all of a sudden going to start managing buildings, but it does mean that there's a role that the city can play. Like there's resources at the city that if we actually synergize those efforts with what's happening in schools, we can have a greater impact. One of the things we talk a lot about, people throw this word collective impact around a lot. I think it, became a buzzword. There's an actual model, but a lot of people just say it and they really mean working together. But there's a difference between working together where we get an additive kind of impact. Oh, you're doing this and I'm doing that. Kind of 1 + 1 or 2 + 2 is 4. But there's a totally different kind of scenario when we start having a multiplier effect. Right. And to me, that's like true synergy where we can start to multiply our efforts, where you're getting far greater outcomes than what any of us could achieve by ourselves. And I think that is ultimately what we have to do. A couple critical things that I would add to that is, a lot of collective impact models, they look at these large organizational players, these institutions that align resources, and that's great. But I think for what we want to see in this city, if we want to be successful, that collective impact has to also include very deep community engagement, where you have, everyday people, children, families, community leaders that are just as deeply involved and seen as thought leaders in that process as, the head of, UPMC or, city councilmen and folks of that nature. And so I think it would be really critical to have a more grassroots approach to any kind of collective impact, sort of effort. A couple of things I want to say about, James spoke about success in schools. A lot of this stuff is somewhat predictable, but I think a lot of times in response to crisis, in response to challenges, we often make decisions that maybe look great in the short term, but they are very damaging to our long-term success. When James talks about some of the schools around the city that have seen success, they've got some key ingredients that when you look around the country, they have the same ingredients. You talk about strong leadership and longevity. You can't turn schools around overnight. A year, 2-year initiative is not going to do it. But oftentimes we haven't put the context in place to be able to retain some leaders and make those positions attractive in some of our buildings that need the most help. Or you put a leader in place, but they're not necessarily confident that they're going to be around long enough to make a huge impact. And once you have that strong leadership in place and there's commitment to that, then the number one ingredient that you need to transform learning is strong teachers. But strong teachers are only going to stick around, usually strong environments where there's good leadership and good direction and things of that nature. And when you look at, James, you talked about correlation and causation. I mean, when you look at the data in some of the schools in our district that have some of the highest teacher turnover rates, like not even just year to year, I mean, even within year, those are some of the schools where you have the greatest challenges. And so sometimes we look at the data and we'll point fingers at a principal or assistant superintendent. But when you look at all of these additional factors that are in place, we're not necessarily setting our leaders up and our schools up for success. And I think those are things that as a community we can rally around, right? Where it's not just a principal fighting for themselves or an assistant superintendent or a school board member, but it's really the entire community understanding what's at stake and how we can all play a role in making that improvement. But again, I believe in that collective impact approach because it will take all of us. We all have a role to play in educating our children, and we definitely need to own our individual pieces of what it will take to transform education within the city.
Thank you. I saw Ms. Reed come on camera. I believe she wanted to also chime in.
Okay, there we go. Sorry for my inability to turn my camera on. I was just going to say that lots of times when you hear people talk about collective impact, it sounds like, a very lovely party that we all go to and everyone sits around and everyone contributes what they can. But we have to remember that real collective impact is very difficult work, and it takes commitment, and it takes folks changing their minds, and it takes people changing practice, and it takes all of us to look without rose-colored glasses at data, and to really examine how best we all collectively can improve outcomes for kids. It's just sometimes I think when people mention it, and I know James knows this, and I know Walter knows this, that it's very, very hard work. But when people hear it, it sounds lovely, and it's very, very difficult work, and it's something that if we don't completely commit to, it is it won't happen.
Thank you. I have one more specific question I have a number of questions, but I have a specific one for Sala, then I want to turn it over to my colleagues. Sala, has the school board of directors discussed year-round education? And the reason why I'm asking, and I had this conversation with some other administrators, and Reverend Burgess in his sort of opening remarks mentioned that the studies are showing that, well, one, we already know most, especially Black children, were already behind in grade levels, performance, reading, and math. Two, the studies are showing that many children are now an additional 2 years behind because of having to learn from home for a year. And in order to catch up, I'm of the belief that PPS needs to be looking at a year-round model. And I've heard that, there's concerns with the PFT, but in researching, what I've also learned is that the Public School Code of 1949 actually gives the school board of directors the power to actually decide you're going year round for up to 4 years. So the school board could literally say, we are doing this. We have the legal authority, the state gives it to us, and we're going to change the length of our academic school year. Has the school board of directors discussed a year-round model of education at all?
Thanks for the question. I have not been a part of such a discussion. It is difficult for us to even get a discussion for extended day, much less extended year. And I think those kinds of models of success need to be researched and brought forward as a part of our learning of what are the ingredients for success. And once we know what the ingredients are for success are, then we need to have the will and the courage to implement those systems to create that success. We haven't had, as a board, collectively, we haven't had the will. I think that one of the reasons why I got on the board is because I considered our board to be complacent and okay with just getting along. We don't really need a high quality, high performing school system. Good enough is just good enough. And so we have not been pushed, which is why I encourage council to keep pushing us until we grasp the things, commit to the hard work that was referred to just a minute ago by Tracy, and get the job done. It requires leadership that is willing to put in the hard work, and quite frankly, we don't have it yet.
Thank you. For my colleagues' benefit, and I'll let you get in, Mr. Walker. I did have sort of this conversation with at least one school administrator about year-round, what that could look like. And one of the things that was said to me was, if we were to consider that model, we would actually need the support of the city. We would need support of your rec centers, your pools, and other resources that the city would need to help bring to the table. And so, so as we begin thinking and discussing this, and maybe potentially wanting to put on the table, the city of Pittsburgh would need to bring additional resources to the table, assisting with transportation and a number of other things. But Mr. Walker, you were trying to get in?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of echo, some of what Sala was saying, in that, we've been doing education, not just in Pittsburgh, but across the country the same way for 50, 60 years. And so the education that my kids got, starting in 2009, looks very similar to the education that I got coming out of Pittsburgh Public Schools in 1994. And so, I agree that we need to take bold steps and do things different. We don't have to blow up the whole system, but we have to be willing to tackle each and every piece of the system. There can't be parts of, of this educational system that we're not willing to look at, to talk about, to pick apart and dissect. So, the PFT is, a powerful force in this, but we can't be afraid to engage in those conversations. There's been a lack of communication between the school board and outside organizations, and we can't be afraid to have those conversations. Obviously, this is a step with City Council, and I'm looking forward to the new mayor coming in, because again, we can't be afraid to bring in experts from outside of the school district to help solve some of the very challenging problems that we have. So, we can't keep doing the same thing and hope that things are going to change, right? We have to be able and willing to take chances, informed chances, but chances that are going to help solve this problem and do it faster than any of us think is possible at this point.
Your
Thank you.
audio is much better, Brother Walker.
It is.
Thanks. I had to disconnect and reboot my computer, so I was hoping that would work.
One last question, and then I will cease the floor. Mr. Fogarty, you mentioned that we were one of the better funded urban school districts. Since we declared this, one of the things we heard was, well, the school district needs more resources. We need more finances. Obviously, the same way the city of Pittsburgh is getting ARP funding, our school district will as well. Can you speak a little bit about, is this a financial issue? Is the problem with our children not being educated properly due to financial constraints?
Yes and no, right?
Okay.
I will say that under the current educational delivery model and the number of schools that we have, if you continue to have schools that on average are 30, 40, 50% empty compared to what they used to be, right? We used to be a city of 700,000 people with a school system closer to 70, 80,000 kids. We are now at about 21,000 students pre-K to 12. And we've made adjustments. We've made painful adjustments that have hurt, historically Brown and Black communities. And so I think there's a lot of hesitancy to think about what it would take to use resources more efficiently within the district. But, if you look at us compared to other cities across the country, and even in the state of Pennsylvania, because of Hold Harmless, we're in the top 5% of school districts in the state in terms of spending per pupil, spending more than Fox Chapel per pupil, spending more than Mount Lebanon per pupil. And yes, we have needs. Yes, we do, no doubt. But this is not a resource question. Fundamentally, the resources are here. It's about how they're allocated, where they're allocated, and to what end, right? And when you looked at the chart that I presented, and when we provide pretty much equal funding for a whole set of schools, regardless of the level of poverty in the schools. And we know that as you increase concentrations of poverty, there's great studies out of Stanford. I encourage you to go to the Stanford resources that exist that have talked about this. Where there are high concentrations of poverty, there's a much greater difficulty in changing things, right? Now, so the yes is, under the current model, sure, we could use more people, but we're at 11 to 1. I want to mention, just because I know folks mentioned the PFT, and maybe that's, I will say, as someone who's worked for the last 3 years at Perry High School with a group of folks to try and make change, one of the things that I've seen from educators is a real lack of trust in our ability to make change that they actually buy into. And so we took a different approach, which was harder and took a lot of work, but over 3 years built trust with a group of teachers and created a plan for change at that school, and got 78% of the teachers in that school, with the support of the PFT, to change the schedule. So that's a block schedule. So now kids are going to have half an hour more of instruction every day at the school, and they're going to start half an hour later. That was done by a vote of the educators in the building. And what I think we've done is put sort of the boogeyman of the collective bargaining agreement in as it's impossible to change that. It's hard, right? It's hard because there are entrenched interests that are hard fought for, right? And so we have to be willing to say, let's do this hard work and have the hard conversations with our educators who are in our buildings and who are ultimately going to be charged with making the change. To Walter's point, right? The people that have the greatest ability to turn this around, especially for Black and Brown children, are our educators. So that's not to say there aren't issues, right? There aren't issues that are within the contracts that are impacting Black and Brown kids. There are. But I do think if we were to go forward in a spirit of collaboration, say, what's we're willing to make this work. How can we make it work and really walk through? It may not happen overnight, but I do think there's an ability and an opportunity here to make change. So to the point around year-round school, I think that would be possible. There's also a lot of ways to think about year-round schooling or year-round learning, kind of to Walter's point, that it happens in the community too, right? You've got summer boost, but you also have you have over $1.5 million investment through the United Way and foundations to support a variety of organizations to do summer learning this summer. We have these ESSER funds, ESSER 3 under the American Recovery Plan. Like, there's an opportunity for the district to also say, hey, you have community partners who are doing really good work with kids. Let's get together, think about how we can work together and align it so that, our community organizations that are doing great work, whether they be in Homewood or the Hilltop or in the North Side or West End, right? Like those organizations, those grassroots organizations are part of the solution. And so thinking about how you extend the learning year and the learning day, right? It real easy to think about how you might be able to do that in the existing constructs that we have. So I think it's about again, to the point around, do we have enough resources? Sure, you could have infinite resources and that would be helpful, but unless you have a structure or a system that is aligned to getting outcomes for Black and brown kids that are better, I don't know what spending more money gets you other than additional hands, which may or may not be helpful if there's not alignment, if there's not a strategy, if there aren't good goals.
We still need you to give us our money back that you took from us, City Council.
For the record, City Council did not take the money. The state took the money and provided it to the city. I will yield the floor, Reverend Burgess.
Thank you very much. Councilwoman Deb Gross.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. And Mr. Udine, I actually had a constituent ask not long ago why they couldn't find the school board budget when they were looking at the city budget. They really thought that it was just a small fraction of the city budget. And so like, well, I see there's $100 million spent on police. How much of the city budget is spent on the schools? So they were under the impression that the city, the Pittsburgh public school budget was something like $50 million and they just couldn't find what page it was on. And in fact, you spend more money per year in the operating budget than the city of Pittsburgh, right? So what are we online to spend this year? About 570 million. I don't know what you're spending this year. Do you know?
660 million.
Yeah. So we're neck and neck there on what we spend for sure. So I want to thank all of the speakers, of course, for making the time to be here with us today to help us understand the kind of all of the policy ins and outs, right? And sometimes people wonder what post agendas are for. They're really for us to help us make better policy, right? You are here to edify us, to bring us the information that you think we need to know. So I appreciate the slideshow and the input and also kind of getting to know kind of what roles each of the players in the space in the city occupy. That's also sometimes a really helpful input that we need because we are not experts on everything. We are neither omniscient nor omnipotent, right, as city council members. So it's really excellent for us and for the public to have the information that you're bringing to us. So I'd like to return to, I think, a question that I heard Councilman Lavelle ask, which was, kind of in this collaboration that you're envisioning, what space does City Council occupy? What can we do more of? What can we do better to support the students' achievement? Right, that is the goal of the conversation, right? How to improve Pittsburgh Public School students' achievement, make it more equitable, but dramatically improve it, especially for our Black students. And so while we can all kind of have the same goal and this, the share sentiment, we do have different jurisdictions, and there are things that we have jurisdiction over that you do not, and vice versa. So let me just kind of make some suggestions. When I when I see the map that was in the slide presentation about attendance, I have concerns about housing insecurity, right? That is what I've usually heard from people in different schools, right? That that their students don't live where they lived yesterday, right? They've been put out, they've been forced out. They're in need of housing, they're housing insecure. We've been talking a lot this year and not doing a very good job at managing the eviction crisis that is facing our households in the city of Pittsburgh. I think all of us can only expect that to become worse as the federal emergency declarations are ending. There are now many, many hundreds, if not thousands, of cases pending in the city alone. There's also a layer on that map that you showed us, Mr. Fogarty, at Create Lab of evictions. So you layered school attendance with blood lead levels. I'm really glad that CMU is tracking those blood lead levels. We have, many of us on city council have also been working to bring down any contaminants that we can, including, of course, water service lines, my role at PWSA, but also lead paint is a deep concern. We know that the majority of lead poisonings in the city of Pittsburgh are caused by paint, right? We do not inspect for paint. We could fund our permits, licenses, and inspections to inspect for paint, and we should. And we haven't, because we haven't wanted to add the bodies to permits, licenses, and inspections. The director needs at least 4 more inspectors dedicated to lead inspections to be able to do that. I think we should give her those positions. And I think we should begin those inspections. We've been stalling as a city because we were waiting for the revenue from a rental registry. We don't need to wait if we're willing to pay for it. So I'll just leave that there on the table. So that's 2 things then, right? So I mentioned housing insecurity. I think that is something that we can do better. Perhaps there's ways we can work together on that. I don't know where your jurisdiction and capacity is around housing. Lead paint is definitely, I think, where we're behind as a city, and we should do better. And we would welcome input from the county, in fact, because the county also has a Department of Health, and they can lend, I think, support to inspections and lead paint remediation and abatement. We know that our households, we have a high level of food insecurity. I've heard that negatively affects students' performance, right? I'm not the educational experts, right? But this is kind of the general understanding. We, I think, have done a wonderful job from what I'm hearing from our Parks and Rec department, that the schools district provided meals that our Parks and Rec department helped to distribute. So thank you for that. So over the last 1.5 years of COVID, our Parks department has moved nearly 1 million meals with our city staff. Differently than they were before, right? You used to have to show up if you showed up and you had to show that you were enrolled in a summer program. It was this bad before COVID. The kids weren't allowed to take the food home from our summer programs. And if you ask me, that's dumb. Because of the federal constraints of the funding, the food was only for while you were there at your summer program, at the art card or at the pool, wherever it was. Let's stop doing that. So now under COVID, any family in the city can go to one of our distribution sites and take meals home, right? We can all agree at this table, I think, let's keep doing that. So we moved 1 million meals, but the city proper didn't pay for the meals, is what I'm told and what I understand. That Pittsburgh Public Schools provided meals, and then another vector for meals was the Area Agency on Aging, so basically state county support. That's something we can coordinate on. Let us not have any hungry students, right? We know that of our poor, council members are sick of me kind of quoting the study from the Women and Girls Foundation, the Femisphere report that we've been using now for a number of years. And what they did was analyze poor households in the city of Pittsburgh using county data. I've looked at the raw data myself. We're hoping this will be updated, of course, with new census data. But if you look at who is below the poverty line in the city of Pittsburgh, 70% of the households in poverty are female-headed households with children. Right, and so we know they have, of course, the burdens on their household for cost burdens are housing, as I mentioned, food, as I mentioned, but also childcare. And I think between us, we've tried to put funding into childcare. I'm incredibly grateful that the federal government is talking about putting funding into childcare, that our city families can enroll very soon. I think there's already a website link to enroll for a $300 per month credit per child, something like that. I don't want to quote it indirectly, but it's generally that. That's what our vice president just announced this week. But that we also support the child care centers. I know they're not schools, and I know we have lots of different kinds of businesses in the city, but we know that this is a problem. We know that our female-headed households have child care problems that they are unable to solve. We know that we do not have enough child care seats in the city for infants, for 1-year-olds, for 2-year-olds, for 3-year-olds, on up to 5-year-olds in school enrolled, right? We know that it's expensive. We know that there are 2-year waiting lists. We know that it's an obstacle. I'm told that sometimes it's the older siblings who have to provide care, right? I'm sure that negatively affects school attendance. So we can do better at these things, right? There are ways that we can do what we can do, but we can try to make sure that we coordinate the efforts so that we are solving the problems that can help you succeed, right? That to get the obstacles out of your way. So I want to suggest that we continue these conversations on concrete steps and not just good intentions. We know the things that we are capable of doing, but there may be things that I didn't mention here that we haven't even thought of yet. And so we're definitely open and eager. At least I'm speaking for myself, open and eager to hearing what these problems are, because we do know that what we do impacts your students. And we know that having a stronger school system helps the city succeed. So I was intending to ask questions, and then I got on a roll and I just kept talking. So let me just stop there. See any response, sorry.
Well, I'd like to make a comment on that, because I think you make some really good points that there are areas that Pittsburgh Public Schools and our families need. I think for students to be successful in school and out of school, they have to feel safe first, right? Safe students learn better, they integrate in their community better, they participate better. And so one of the areas where I think the city and the city council can help partner is, how do we make the time when our students leave their house in the morning to go to school and the time that they leave school to go back to their homes, how do we make that a safer time for them so that they have the opportunity to participate in after-school programs or go to the local park to meet new friends? How do we make them feel safer? And how do we actually make them safer? And then the other area, and this is one of the areas that was exposed by COVID that Pittsburgh Public Schools wasn't prepared for, right? We did a really good job making sure that all of our students had a device that they could use for school, but we didn't do a great job of making sure that they could actually use that device in their home or in their community. And so I think one of the ways the city can help kind of foster that is, how do we build broadband infrastructure in our city that allows our students to access the technology that as a school district we've been able to give them. So first we keep them safe, then we help them to actually use the resources that we've given them. And I don't have answers for either of those questions, but my kids were fortunate that we are in a position to provide them with as safe a home as we can, as well as the access to use the technology that was available. But I know that that is not the same everywhere. And if we want to make sure that our students are successful, we need to be able to work together to provide those two things. And then I'll stop there and let someone else talk.
Yeah, thank you, Gene. If I could jump in, I have like a broader comment, but I want to speak directly to the two things that Gene mentioned, because I think there's two really tangible things that I think City Council could play a role in related to both of those. I mean, so one is, it's not the end all be all solution of safety, but safe routes to school. So we've been working with the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. I know they've got some funding, I believe, from PennDOT to support safe routes, but that funding is heavily limited in the sense, like they're only focusing on a couple of schools right now. And again, I think the team at DOMI is doing the best that they can do, but there could be a larger concerted effort from the city. We got a couple meetings scheduled, and again, I'm in Homewood, so I'm focusing largely on Faison and Lincoln at this point in time, and Westinghouse, but we're talking about crossing guards. And in a lot of our communities, the route to school is not safe to walk, right? There aren't a lot of crossing guards, patrolling the streets, helping kids, cross these dangerous streets and things of that nature. Another thing is that, again, is under you guys' jurisdiction that could be supported, is even the sidewalks, the pathways to school, a lot of times are littered with overgrown lots, lots that are unsafe, abandoned and blighted properties that kids have to walk past. And so some of those properties are under city jurisdiction. They may be owned by the city or the URA, or certainly the city could, lean on certain authorities to, better manage those properties and things of that nature. So again, I think those are some things specific to safety. Another piece on the broadband internet access, I know there's been a couple of projects, and I believe the city's been involved in at least some. We've had some conversations. I know I've spoken with Rep. Gainey about some projects, and also Councilman Burgess, but we've been working with Carnegie Mellon and some folks from MetaMesh Wireless communities to look at like a long-term, what we hope will be a long-term broadband solution for anybody in the city who needs access to internet, who may not be able to afford, Verizon or Comcast kind of solution to be able to have access, because we know that this is a critical need. And again, I don't know how involved the city has been. We've been looking at a couple of neighborhoods right now. We've been focused on bringing this project to Homewood. So we've gotten a lot of the infrastructure is getting ready to be put in place. And so we should be able to have more people having access in the community. But this could be something that becomes citywide if it was something that council decided was of a large enough priority. And then the last thing, just to kind of more general, I think that the city could really potentially get behind. I think we've got a powerful vehicle of community schools. It seems to be one of the things that there's a lot of alignment around, right? So you've got, pretty much unanimous support from the school board.
Mr. Lewis, you're, for me, I've broken up. It's right after you said community schools. I couldn't hear anything else.
Yeah, am I still coming through clearly, or is it still
clear now? I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. So I think community schools is one of those initiatives that has just a lot of support across many different stakeholders. You pretty much have unanimous support from the Board of Education, the school board. You have support from the district. It's an office right in the superintendent's cabinet. The Pittsburgh Federation of Teachers, I've had many conversations with Nina and Billy. There's a lot of support from the PFT, and generally speaking, the community has been also very supportive of these schools. So I think it's a mechanism that could be utilized to actually bring a lot of resources.
Well, let me ask you about that then. Why don't we have them, or more of them? Or do we have any?
So we do.
We know,
right now we have.
While I've been in office, Sunnyside has been hoping for this now for years. Where I represent in Stanton Heights. What's the obstacle?
So I can speak to it from kind of a community perspective.
That's true.
Perhaps Brother Sala could speak to it from a board perspective, because he's been in some of those conversations. But what I can say is we currently have, to my knowledge, I believe 9 community schools. I know in Homewood, we've been working with the 3 schools, Lincoln, Faison, and then Westinghouse as community schools within Homewood. And since then, the district has sort of formally adopted community schools and has expanded it to other schools across the city. One of the challenges with community schools in terms of, founding community schools and getting them started, there's some funding concerns and things of that nature in terms of you got to hire a community school site director. I'm not sure of all of the politics that have gone into which schools have been selected and some of those kinds of things. What I can say from a personal standpoint is what I've seen is it's really critical to have buy-in from that school leadership and from that community. You can put a community school in place in name, but if there's not wholesale buy-in where the leaders understand what it is and what it can be, and the teachers understand what it is and what it can be, you're going to find yourself kind of turning your wheels and not necessarily having the greatest impact that the school could possibly provide. But my point in mentioning it is I think it's a great vehicle that could be used to deliver a lot of these different kinds of things, right? Because the concept of the community school is about leveraging all of these community resources to support the education of the children. And so I think it could be a great way. You know, we know a lot of these kinds of things take time. But community schools is a vehicle that exists. There's policy at the board level that allows for some of these things to take place. And so I think that is something that we can look at as a community, as a vehicle to maybe do some deeper interventions to tie into some of those different things that you mentioned, Councilman Gross. And then Brother Sala, I don't know if you have anything else to add from a board member standpoint around just kind of how you guys view community schools and, you know, which schools were selected and maybe not selected.
Well, I think that the fundamental problem, to answer Ms. Gross's question, is we don't have all in more community schools because we don't have the leadership and the prioritization to create those community schools. We can give lip service to ideas, but good ideas cost money. And if we really believe in community schools, we will put the resources in to make all of our schools community schools. And I think that with more communication and collaboration between the school district and the city and the county and the stakeholders all working together to create this collective impact that was talked about earlier, we can certainly add to the resources that are currently being put to community schools to make all of our schools community schools.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Udine. I also just wanted to acknowledge that I am also super supportive of the safe routes to schools and have been a terrible nag to DOMI in my own district about where schools are and where we need crosswalks, where we need crossing guards. And I believe that we as the city should do better with crossing guards. One of those things when you start kind of teasing out what are the obstacles here is that I had constituents who were eager to do crossing guard work, but the way it was structured, and I'm hoping this changed because the contract has been renegotiated, was that you couldn't pick where you were assigned, especially if you didn't have seniority, right? So while you might be eager to be within anywhere in a mile or two of your house because you also have kids and they are going to be home after school, you might have been assigned, 15 miles away, which in the city could be, an hour away during that time of day. So that was we couldn't get, the public safety kept saying they couldn't get people to apply. But then as council members, you had dozens of people wanting to do it. And so people have taken to be doing it voluntarily, which we don't advise, isn't safe, but they're just donning their own orange vests and getting out there. And we need official, paid, trained crossing guards, but we need to be able to work with them and so that they can match their work needs with our staffing needs. But I see Councilwoman Smith is on there. So Mr. Dean, I'm going to interrupt you because I see Councilwoman Smith. So I'm going to cede the floor to her, I think is next. Mr. Burgess.
That's correct. Councilwoman Smith.
Can't hear her. You're muted.
Thank you, Councilwoman. I'll be brief too, because I actually have a meeting. I got to drive and listen at the same time. Thank God I didn't wreck. But I just want to say, well, first of all, post agenda, I heard you mention, Councilwoman, that it's for gathering information, but usually gathering information means more than one side, and this seems very one-sided to me. So I just want to say, I think that we need to have additional people at this table. And when it comes to A+ schools, I've had questions about A+ schools, their funding, and some of their direction and their mission for quite some time. I think back before when Ms. Saladin, I think you were on the board, or you may have been one of the initial founders with Tom Murphy of the group that formed into A+ schools. And at first I thought it was a great idea. And over the years, I've had a lot of concerns about them, mostly about their funding and how sometimes groups, once they receive funding, they have to do what not necessarily what their mission was intended for. So I have a lot of concerns with that. But as I look through this, I'm curious, who funds Black Women for Better Education? Who are the funders for that organization? Does anyone know who accepted money for them or accepted their endorsement? Do you know who you accepted an endorsement from?
Yes, we do know who we accepted an endorsement from.
Could you share that publicly, please?
It's the PAC part of Black Women for a Better Education has been supported by individuals all over the city. There haven't been any foundations that have supported the organization because it's not an organization.
Anyone who works for the foundations?
I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure I work for a
too.
foundation and I gave to Black Women for Better Education. So, I mean, I'm sure there are, folks who work for foundations who also gave, like there are folks who work for foundations who've given to all kinds of
I'm just wondering if there's any cross between A+ schools and this organization and the Homewood Children's Fund. I'm just wondering if there's any connection between all of them and all of you, because you were all supported by the same, the people here that ran for office were supported by the same organization.
Councilman Burgess.
Well, and I would assume that you can find, their campaign finance report.
Councilman Burgess.
Excuse me.
The direction that we are going in is going to send us down a rabbit hole.
I have the floor.
That will not be,
Mr. Chair.
That will not be productive. When we started this conversation with sharing information,
and then is not going to stop you.
Teresa Kale Smith gets on the line and starts attacking people.
So here I will say this. So what I'm doing is asking you, if you feel it's an attack,
what you do, your
taking money from somebody,
questions
if I'm asking, right, I think the public has a right to know who you're funded by and who is supporting you and what this agenda is really, really possibly about. So
that's the reason why we have not been able to get together so far.
So now I'll ask about the data. And so what were your sources? Did you list all the sources for all your data? That's what I want to know. And when it was done?
No, if the source was not listed, it came from the A+ schools report to the community, and the data that comes from that comes from PDE and the Pittsburgh Public Schools, with whom we have a data sharing agreement. We work very closely with them to scrub and look at the data. And if there's any inconsistencies, we always work with their data team every year when we do our report to the community to ensure that the data is accurate and provided fulsomely and completely school by school to all 15,000 parents in the Pittsburgh Public Schools. And we provided additional 5,000 copies to our libraries, to our council people, to magistrate judge offices, to pediatricians, and then we put it up online. And if there are ever any questions or needs for correction, we always make them as soon as possible once they are known. But we provide the data that's given to us both by Pittsburgh Public Schools and the Department of Education.
So I'm actually pretty fortunate. In my district lives the person who did that data for Pittsburgh Public Schools for years and for the state for many years. So, I mean, I'm happy to share that with her and see what her thoughts are about that. So thank you for that. And at least gives me something to share with her. But I will say that I hope that the next post agenda includes additional opinions and additional backgrounds. I know that Reverend really wants to do a lot of things for the schools, and so do I. And as a matter of fact, I started the Education Commission a long time ago, and it's still not does not have a board seated. So if council wants to do that, we could do that. if you're interested in the schools. But what I don't want to see is people coming in and saying that they care about Black and brown children and really having another agenda and using Black and brown children to get to that agenda.
What
That does-
agenda do you think
That
people
does
have?
not, that
What
does not
agenda?
really benefit Black and brown children.
What
I mean,
agenda do
we
you
have
think
had this-
people have?
We have had this. Mr. Dean, I'm sorry, do you not know how council operates? It's usually I speak and then I ask the question. So I will just say, with that said, I think that we need to make sure that what we're doing is actually going to benefit the children of the city of Pittsburgh and to make sure that it benefits our city and our schools. And I think that when we work together, as Councilman Gross and I did yesterday, with the administration, with the foundations, with the county, we were able to come up with some possible solutions on how we're going to work with our kids and do some things for the kids as well. So I do think that there's a benefit to us working together, but we have to be sincere and open about what our real agendas are and what we're trying to accomplish. And I think if we do that, we'll probably come together on a lot of things where we actually do agree. But I also think that when you're talking about keeping kids from early in the morning to late at night and doing all these things and school for year-round school, you're talking a lot about keeping kids away from their families, but I don't hear anybody talking a lot about building up the family unit and helping the families. Because in my district, we have a lot of open CYF cases. And to me, that's what's going to help kids, is helping them to come home to a safe environment. Because at some point they have to go home, whether we keep them early in the morning, late at night, year round, sooner or later, they either have to go home, or in some cases, kids are sleeping in parks or out on the street because they're too afraid to go home. So I think if we're not having a conversation that includes the parents, then we are really missing the mark, and we're really not sincere about helping kids, because we really have to include them, families, whether it's a parent, a guardian, a grandparent. Nancy Hornsby had a great program on the Hill District for the second time around grandparent program. And without that program, there's a big void of resources for parents. And she did just an amazing job. And I know several times Nancy's looked into returning to the district. And I think if you're sincere, you'd maybe look into what she could bring to the table, because they have to be part of the solution, or there is no solution. You're eventually going to send kids home to the same dysfunction. In many cases, some of them left in the morning.
Anything else?
Councilman Burgess, could I have a question?
So
I think that's it.
All right, so let me sort of help if I can. So let me be as honest with you as I can be with everyone. I have one interest. I only have one interest, and this is not an interest today. It's not an interest a week ago. It's not an interest a month ago. It's not an interest a year ago. I've spent 40 years of my life, all of my professional life, on one issue, and one issue only. I've done other things, but the one thing that's been consistent is the academic achievement of children, particularly Black children. That is overwhelmingly a focus of mine. It has been, continues to be. In Pittsburgh, I think the first thing we have to agree on in order to go forward for anything is that all of our kids, that the school district is failing. And that's the part that's uncomfortable, but it's true. The school district is failing its students. In particular, African-American students are failing disproportionately. So we need to be honest about that. That should be where we start at. And we all agree the school system is failing and Black kids are failing disproportionately. That's a truth. So once we agree with that, the rest of it becomes a lot easier. What bothers me is the lack of responsibility of saying we are not doing a good job educating our kids. We are not, which is why my kids didn't go to public school, right? I've made that choice to send my children to private school. I paid a whole lot of money to get my kids into private schools. It was successful for me, right? 3 of my 4 children are in graduate school right now. It was very successful for me. My kids have achieved. But I'm arguing that it shouldn't have had to be that way. I think they shouldn't have had to pay $20,000, $30,000 a year in private school tuition in order for kids to achieve academically. And my interest is that I don't think the schools can do it alone. If they could have done it alone, they would have done it alone. Since the kids are failing, Since the school district is failing, it just seems to me common sense that we should all be involved. Every family, every church, every community-based organization, every mayor, every council member, and I don't think there's any argument about that, right? We should all be involved. Then the question is, how do we do it? What I have found is whenever, and the only reason I did not run for school board is because my kids went to private school. It's the only reason. I would have ran for school board years ago because I'm interested in public schools. I've served the public schools. As you know, I've run programs for the schools. But how do we get our kids to achieve academically? The other thing is, I'm going to suggest to you that the needs of African-American children are sometimes different. And since the bulk of the district is African-American kids, and the bulk of the student failure are African-American kids, we need to be really clear about how our resources are affecting specifically African-American kids where the heart of the problem. Because oftentimes what I've found in education is they'll put money to everybody, but you'll find that money being spent either, as Mr. Fogarty has told us, evenly among all kids, or in sometimes even unequally, where the smarter kids would tend to be non-African American, getting more resources than the African American kids that are struggling. Now, to do this, we're going to have lots of, if this is minoring compared to the rest of the conversations we have to have, right? We have to have these uncomfortable conversations where there is suspicion, there's distrust, there are all this stuff, right? But at the end of the day, and which is why, if you've noticed in all of my comments, I've only focused on academic achievement, nothing else. I've not talked about union issues. I've not talked about superintendent issues. I've not talked about quality of instruction. None of that stuff, to me, we can talk about it, but I think that gets us in a rabbit hole that's not helpful. I think if we can focus narrowly on what can we do to increase the academic level of our children, of all children, that's the starting place of unity of everybody can agree on. I don't think there's a person on this call that disagrees with that goal. What can we do? We may disagree. I think that's right, right? Teresa, right? We all agree with that, yes? No?
So it is right. It is right. And even when I get angry because people have not cared about the kids for all these years. People have not done a lot of things for our kids. But I do know, and Sal will be surprised to hear me say this, is that I do know that he has done this for a very long time. So it's nothing new to him. But it is new to a lot of people. And I'm just going to say, I think when we're talking about student achievement, we're talking about teachers, and we're talking about how Black teachers matter in the classroom, which, you know, my future daughter-in-law is a teacher in the Pittsburgh public schools. And I'll just say that I think it matters, but I also think it matters that the superintendent, that we're supportive of some of the things that the superintendent does. And I think if you can't say it for one person and not or for one group of people, but not the other. And I just don't always hear that. I feel like sometimes there's a lot of attacks, and I don't know whether they're just or not. I don't know enough about the district and the direction they're taking. But I do hear what you're saying, Reverend, about keeping it focused on student achievement. And if that's the goal, and keeping kids safe in and out of the schools, then I'm in for that conversation. That's all I'll say.
So again, this is my time. I'm not going to be long. I have nephews and nieces. I have 8 of them, grand nieces and nephews. One of them, until the pandemic, a group of them, we had over at least 1 to 2 weekends a month. We had them, right? My kids are older now, but they're young, grade school kids. And of course, as we do all of our kids, we don't, watch TV or play video games only. We do academic work. I've always done that. My nieces and nephews can't read. They go to public schools and they can't read. This can't go. We can't let this continue, right? We can't let these kids can't read. They can't do math. We know they can't. They can't do it. And the pandemic has made this worse. If they were behind 2 and 3 grade levels before the pandemic, after having 2 years of non-education, Black children, for the most part, disproportionately, didn't even log into the system. My daughter-in-law works she's a teacher at Bashir. They didn't log in. Most of her students never logged in. 2 years of non-instruction. If they couldn't read and do math before this, if they were 2, 3, 4 grade levels behind before the pandemic, where do you think they're at now? This has to be, and the reason I'm saying this so blatantly is everybody has to, in order, what I believe, and I'll ask James to help me, maybe I'm crazy. I think this has to be, in particular for the Black community, single women with kids, absolutely has to be, this education of our kids has to be a fundamental priority of every family, of all the organizations in the city of Pittsburgh, or it's not going to get better. It's awful. I'm talking too much. The academic achievement of these kids is awful, especially of Black kids. And we're acting like it's okay. It's not okay. Because let me finish. When they can't read, we know what's going to happen. When they can't do math, we know what's going to happen. Because I've done lots of things in my career, including working in jails. We know what that happens. We know that if you want to find out who's going to jail, do it by area code. And when you go to those zip codes, we see poor Black people, poor Black families, low educational outcome. We know what's going to happen. It's clear what's going to happen. So we need to be honest in our city that this is an emergency, a crisis, an awful situation. All the numbers I've read were pre-pandemic. I'm afraid to find out where those kids are now. There's been no testing. They didn't test them last year. I'm all about this year. Last year, they didn't test them. I know that they're worse. I know my nieces, nephews, children in my church are worse. So let's figure it out. Let's not talk about turf because these are kids. I mean, maybe I'm crazy. I guess maybe I'm crazy. The reason that Councilman Val, he still has young kids, the reason we're going down this road is because it just seems to me that we're not being honest and open about the achievement level of the kids, and we're not doing, and the idea that in order to do academic achievement, we really know how to do it. It's easy. Everybody has to participate. That means education must be a focus for the kids 24/7 in the families, because we have families that when the kids come home, don't do any academic stuff from the time the kids come home to the time they leave the next morning. That's unacceptable. But they have to be trained. Parents, especially poor parents, have to be trained. I'm talking too much. James, am I nuts? Am I going on the right road, or am I just?
No, I continue to believe that it's going to take a concerted effort. I think what Councilwoman Gross talked about in terms of thinking about the things that you can impact, right? I can show you, Councilwoman Gross, the same maps from CMU that do overlay eviction information with absenteeism and student achievement. I think, there are places today where council could be making a huge impact to support families and support their stabilization, which we know will help improve academic outcomes. We also know that we have great out-of-school time programs and partners willing to stand with our schools to try and improve outcomes. And we know that there's work to be done around supporting real teacher-led professional development and teacher-led improvement, right? And like we've been doing that for 3 years. So I think there are opportunities here that we shouldn't let go to waste. And we've put together what we call 412 Rhymes, which is with boom concepts and open literacy to support students learning via text, video lessons that are delivered via text. We're going to try and continue to innovate in areas where we can support early literacy and beyond. As an organization, we've put money directly into places like Hope for Tomorrow in the West End to support learning hubs for kids in that area, and in the Northview Heights, where young Somali Bantu girls were having to take care of their brothers and sisters. So we worked with Church Union to set up a learning hub there so that the kids, the older girls, could go do schoolwork and their younger brothers and sisters could be cared for in the same location on site at Northview Heights. And we will continue to solve problems because that's what we're about. But there are many. And there are many that are structural, that have been here for years, that are part and parcel of our legacy of racism, our legacy of slavery, and our legacy of oppression in this country. And if we want to talk about social justice, if we want to be really clear about moving forward, then we have to say unequivocally that it's not okay that 70% of the kids that graduate from Pittsburgh public schools don't get a trade certificate or a degree. And it's not okay that over half of our Black third graders, almost 60% of them, don't read at grade level. Because we know from Dr. Hildebrand Pelzer out of Philly, what he sees in educating folks in our incarceration system. They can't read. And they can't read because they weren't taught how to read. And so we have a significant problem that Sala has been on as a school board member to try and teach the science of reading to our teachers and to make sure that we provide materials and that we do that consistently. Macedonia Face is working on an initiative in the Hill District around this. So look, if I didn't believe we could affect it as a parent of 2 children in Pittsburgh public schools, I would step aside and let someone else lead this organization. But right now, I believe this leadership on council, our city's leadership, the leadership of the school board, we have an obligation and a duty to do right by Black and brown children. And I also think we're best situated than we've been in more than a generation to do that.
Mr. Fogarty, I'm trying to be clear. So when I implied that city council should do better in those areas, you responded with the things you had been doing as small programs. Are you asserting that we should not also work on housing insecurity?
No, not at all. I don't know why you would say that. No.
Okay, good.
I would say no. I'm saying the opposite. Like, go work on it. Like, if you want to get more housing inspectors to get rid of lead in the houses, I'm not going to stop you. I'll cheerlead for it. Like, get it done. It's unconscionable that many children are experiencing elevated lead levels in our city. Like,
Right.
Unconscionable. So do something about it.
I'm kind of not understanding what you're responding about.
I'm saying that there are things we can all work on together, that there is a possibility, and I'm on fire about it because since 2012 in my time at A+ schools, but before that as a teacher in the breakthrough programs in this country, I've seen what is possible when we hold high expectations for children, when we provide them support, and when we partner with families. I see success. And so I'm astounded that we can't believe that success is possible for all children in our city. And so I know it's possible.
But no one at this table said that.
No one's saying, no, I'm saying that the reality is we continue to let that happen though, as a city. It's on me just as much as it's on the entire city. We have to say that this is not okay, and then we got to do something about it. I laid out examples of what we can do.
I have a question for Councilman Burgess.
Enough just to say it.
So,
Councilman Burgess, could I have? Yes.
and then I'm going to end this fairly soon. But yeah, Sala, because you can ask me. I'm open to questions.
Thank you. I need to ask you a question because I need to decide whether or not I can make a contribution to this conversation on an ongoing basis.
Yes.
If there are people who members of council want to add to this discussion, are you blocking them from adding people to this discussion?
No.
Then I think we need to clarify what the agenda is going to be, because quite frankly, the school board and the city have had a toxic relationship and have not been able to come together to get things done. And it's the kind of animosity and suspicion that was reflected in some of the questions coming from the president of council, asking people who funded their political campaign before she even opened up with who funds her political campaigns. That kind of conversation is not going to get us where we're going to be, and it is not going to include me in it if that's going to be the nature of the kind of question.
I feel a little uncomfortable with this level of discussion.
Let's not.
Then you should hang up.
So listen.
You should hang up, sir. I can remove you from the table.
Listen. I think this is not helpful. So let me set this straight. And I think I hopefully Councilman Lavelle and I are in agreement. The two of us, along with interested members of council have committed ourselves to having this conversation. And we know this conversation will be uncomfortable. It is not limited, it is open to whoever wants to participate. However, what I am unwilling to do is to stop talking about it. I'm unwilling to stop talking about it. I think as council, we should have a relationship with the public schools. I think we should coordinate. There should be a government to government relationship. It has not been, but it should be. I think that's an agreement. I think it needs to be a coordination with community groups. I think Walter would agree with that, and community-based organizations. We have to. Now, why us? Because, well, we're the two Black members of council, right? And we have some of the lowest performing schools in our district and kids. And so, Sulla, I'm not stopping. I have 2 years left in this term, perhaps, the end of my political career. I spent my life doing this before I was in council. I will spend my life doing this when I'm out of council. I have, out of respect for the district, not been as vocal, although I know I have expertise in this subject matter. But starting now, and I want to make it clear, I'm not going to retreat from this. The academic achievement level of our public schools is unsatisfactory. The achievement level of Black children is abysmal in the Pittsburgh public schools. It is, and I'm a successful parent, right? So I'm not talking about what I don't know or what I haven't done. And I won't give you stories of my own kids in terms of their struggles, but like anyone else, they've had struggles we've had to overcome. I think we should talk about solutions. What are the solutions? And my focus, I think we can, there's always going to be this kind of trauma, and when we are having conversations, they're uncomfortable. Part of the problem is they have to be public, and that's the other thing I want to say. That's what's different about this. They have to be public. There can't be some closed room, secret panel alone that we come and talk to. That's all right. There has to be an open, public, televised conversation about the condition of the schools. I have found that these private conversations don't result in change. We need change. We need longer school. I'm not going to go, I didn't want to go through this today, but absolutely we know we need more academic engagement, period. The kids need more academic engagement, period. Now, whether that's longer days, whether that's more weekend classes, whether that's wraparound services, I think every educational person on this panel would agree our children need more sustained academic engagement. And that's a place to start. How do we get the kids with more academic engagement? That may be the best place to start. How do we do it, right? How do we do it? My kids had year-round school. Even though they didn't go to school year-round, we made sure that they did year-round school. I believe every kid should be in a year-round, intensive, focused educational experience. I believe in longer school. I'm just talking about Ricky Burgess. I believe in longer school days. All of my kids had to do between 2 to 3 hours of academic work after school every day and on weekends. My kids didn't watch TV at all, Monday through Friday. They could only watch TV Saturday and Sunday, and then it went off at 7 o'clock on Sunday. I was intentional about surrounding and immersing our kids in academic achievement. I might as well get on this road. I had a child, one of my children, who was not succeeding in school. We took him to a therapist. He told me, Mr. Burgess, all kids can't learn. So you're putting too much pressure. I said, thank you very much. I appreciate you telling me that. I never took him back. And of course, he graduated from college. If you tell these kids they can succeed and you give them academic support and engagement, they will succeed. So let's figure out how to get these kids more academic exposure, more quality education, how to wrap around all the supports to make these kids successful. Let's focus on that conversation, because I think that will bear fruit. Mr. LaBelle, anything you want to say before? I think we've had enough conversation.
We have. The only thing I can add, and this was to, I guess, President Smith's concern, we are welcoming any and all conversation, all voices and opinions to the table. This is a first of a series of post agendas where we are going to also be inviting and have invited the school board, the superintendent to the table. We are going to hold public hearings so we can hear directly from parents so that they can be engaged in the process. This is, I think we're set for 3 post agendas, 2 public hearings, so that we can get as much information on the table as possible, and then collectively figure out what roles we can have, whether that's some of the stuff that Councilwoman Gross suggested, whether it's working with the school district to provide extended academic support within our rec centers, whatever that may be. That's our intent and that's our goal, because towards Reverend Burgess' point, our children are not succeeding at the academic levels we need them to for our long-term success as a community and as a city. So this is conversation 1, and we thank you all for participating. And we'll be sure to follow up with you all moving forward.
So I'll just do the meeting notice, and then I'll ask for a motion to dismiss. Our city county public hearing schedule is as follows: June 30th at 1:30 in the afternoon, and July 14th at 6:00 p.m. via Zoom. We want to have public hearings. We want to hear from particularly parents, but anyone who want to share with us their experience about academic achievement and the educational emergency in our schools. You can register to speak at the hearing via the online form at pittsburghpa.gov clerk council meetings. They can also call the clerk's office for 412-255-2138. The deadline for registration to speak for the 1:30 p.m. hearing is 11:30 a.m. and the deadline for submission for the 6 p.m. hearing is 3 o'clock the day of each meeting. In addition, at least now, we may have more. We have 2 post agendas scheduled, and I am willing to have more. This is an open conversation. July 7th at 1:30 with the Pittsburgh Public School Board members, superintendent, and PFT president. July 21st at 1:30, the city of Pittsburgh representatives from the charter schools. I want to thank all of you who have come and be a part of this. These are the guests that I invited, mostly me and Lavelle invited, because these are the people we talk to and have a relationship with. It does not mean that there are not other people who will participate and have an opinion. All of us, every citizen of the city, this is an issue for all of us. Let's focus on what we can do to help all of our children, but knowing that the problem disproportionately affects Black and brown children. Thank council people for your participation. And with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting.
So move.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposers, nay. We are adjourned.